Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Copernicus Climate Change Service webinar. This is the C3S Energy Operational Service webinar series. We are the webinar number 5 in this series, and today we're going to hear about the case studies that are being developed under the C3S Energy contract. Sorry, a bit of background noise. If you can adjust that, apologies. Okay, so we should be ready to go now. I want to give you a bit of introduction about the C3S Energy Operational Service first, and then we go through the case studies presentation. So as a bit of a background, C3S Energy Operational Service is based on two previous proof of concepts, the C4E, Clean for Energy proof of concept led by the team at CEA in France, and the ECEM proof of concept led by UEA in Norwich, UK. So these were completed in March 2018. After that, you see on the time slide, in May 2018, we started with the C3S Energy Operational Service, and we are now nearly in the second half, nearly to the end of the 2-year contract. So what we have based the service on is this rationale, which is a development of a climate service with and for energy industry stakeholders, which means that we don't talk just about capacity factors. We also look very closely at energy data and ensure that we have the best possible representation of both climate and energy indicators, both in terms of capacity factors, but also units like watts and megawatt hour and so on. And in so doing, we are also aiming to bridge the communication gap between the climate and energy and involve a wider community in the conversation, including policymakers, strategists, and students too. The products that are being produced by the C3S Energy are basically displayed in one slide here. And at the top, you can see the 3 areas of focus. These are the 3 streams. The first one is related to the past, so the last 40 years or so. Then present, we call this the immediate future, if you wish. So the seasonal forecast from now until 6-7 months ahead. And then we also have the third stream, which is the future with the climate projections. So at the moment, everything is based on European data. There's some thinking around extending to beyond Europe. But for now, this is what is available, I'm afraid, for people outside Europe who are interested in products in their area. But please come and talk to us if you're interested, and we'll be happy to consider your requests and suggestions also for future development. In terms of variables, we have, as I said, both climate and energy variables. In terms of climate variables, we have temperature and precipitation as standard ones, but also specific to energy, wind speed, and solar radiation, as well as mean sea level pressure. In some cases, we also look at relative humidity, as it may be important for indicators like electricity demand. And in fact, in terms of indicators for energy, we have electricity demand, wind power production, both for on and offshore, photovoltaic production, so it's just PV in this case, not concentrating solar power, just because the predominant role of PV at the moment, at least. And hydro production, we have this as both run of the river and reservoir. production, not in this case, not pumped hydro, because of the lack of or weak relationship with climate variables. In all these indicators, what we're trying to capture, rather than the technological developments or social developments, we look at the role of climate on these indicators and try to limit our evaluation to that. We isolate the role of climate and then produce the indicators as best we can. This is then fed into workflow. Each stream has its own workflow. This is a very simplified version of the workflow, but just to give you an idea of the process we go through, from climate data retrieval, assessment, post-processing, and then conversion into energy, and ultimately we'll have a visual demonstrator in the near future. Today, we're going to talk about case studies, as we said, and we are very fortunate to have two members of the contract and also from very active institution in this area. So we have Caroline Acton and Joana Mendes, both from the Met Office. Caroline is going to talk about the motivation for the case studies, and then like an introductory presentation, and then Joana will dive into the details of the case study. So I look very much forward to their presentation, and I'm going to switch over to them right now. I just want to remind you also that we have a question and answer session at the end. And that will you'll have opportunities to ask questions. In fact, you can ask question at any time, and we'll record them and present them at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Caroline now, who is going to present the motivation for the case studies. Thank you, Caroline.
Excellent. So hello, everyone. This is Caroline Acton. What I'd like to do is just go through what we're going to cover in today's presentation. I'm going to focus on the aims and motivations of the case study, and we are going to split the presentation sort of into two key sections. So I'm going to cover why the case studies are relevant, part of the project, the approach that we took to the development of the case studies, and then I'm going to hand over to Joana, who's going to provide an overview of the science approach to the case study development, and also review where we are with the two case studies that we're focused on. So the aims are really to understand how we can utilize cutting-edge climate science to provide the most up-to-date climate information to help decision makers understand and assess their risk exposure to climate change, and then look at mitigation and adaptation measures to support their business decisions. The case studies that we have developed as part of the Copernicus Energy Programme are really aimed at understanding the value add of energy variables, and the case studies are focused on both seasonal and climate timescales. We're also going to investigate the role of energy products derived from the climate data store to support some of the operational decisions that the industry is looking to take. So what research shows us so far is that to generate useful and usable climate information, there is a number of persistent barriers. And the requirements are really based on that the data needs to have credibility, so it has to be authoritative. The data needs to be relevant to the users so they actually can make decisions, and the generation of the data needs to be legitimate so that there is trust in the development of those data sets. These persistent barriers in terms of the usefulness of climate information into climate services is really the gap between working very closely with users to understand their needs and make the outputs very relevant to their organisations. So it becomes very relevant that we engage with users who can work with us to co-design the products that we're looking to develop. And this framework is based on Cash et al.'s 2002 paper. The benefits of working with industry partners in this way It allows us to improve the usability of the data that has been generated. It bridges the gap between the climate information and the ability of users to utilize the data. It also allows us to communicate the uncertainty within the data in a way that's relevant. It increases transparency across the value chain, but also enables us to tailor the climate data into a way that's useful and relevant, which is really a key part of what we're looking to demonstrate within the case studies. And so when we're working with our industry partners, what we're aiming to do with the case studies is to bridge this gap between the knowledge generated within the climate data store and the actual actions that the users can take with regard to that data. And these actions are really based on a risk assessment by the businesses that we're working with. The risk assessment is based on the mitigation of threats to their organisation. So this could be, for example, extreme weather events and how they mitigate these risks, both in terms of long term, but also in terms of looking at seasons ahead. But they're also interested in the opportunity climate data can pose to their organisations. And this could be, for example, in terms of where they allocate renewable assets to support longer term planning, or again, look at shorter timescales in terms of seasonal forecasting and maximise their trading positions. And so it's a balance between these two requirements that industry is looking at. Alberto already mentioned the role of ECEM as a prototype service, and we really built upon the outputs of ECEM and the opportunity it provided to demonstrate the valuable benefit of working in collaboration and partners with a variety of different stakeholders. And the benefit of working together, both with technical partners in the ECEM consortium, but external stakeholders, which included TSOs, DSOs, and a range of different energy companies, is that it enabled us to develop services that were tailored to the requirements of industry. We also looked at the quality and usability of that data to enable us to develop tools that would support that. And this really created the foundations for the project that we're working on at the moment, which will ultimately allow us to deliver commercial products and services that are relevant and useful. So who are the users of the data that we're trying to target with these demonstration case studies? So there are really two sort of users that we'd like to explore and highlight the value that the case studies will have. So we have intermediary commercial third-party organisations. So these are the likes of consultancy companies or commercial weather companies, and the Met Office plays this role in this project. What we're doing is taking the data from the climate data store and transforming it into a way that is usable. And what we're looking to highlight is that there is potential commercial opportunities available for organisations that can take this role and develop that value. And this will allow the data to be further used by the industry itself. But we also want to demonstrate directly to industry the value of this data, and we recognise the expertise within industry itself, and they may be able to access the data from the climate data store and also undergo that transformation process themselves. Through our experience of working with these experts, we understand that they're under resource constraints and they may engage with an intermediary or third-party company to take on that role as well. So we just really trying to highlight the range of different opportunities that are available for these users. So the approach that we took to develop the case studies is based on an agile methodology underpinned by the work that was delivered in the prototype phase. So we have a first stage, which is collaborate. And this stage really involved interviews and workshops with industry partners to understand their business requirements, capture their needs and really identify the gaps. And we spent quite a long time doing this because it was really one of the most important aspects of the project in terms of developing the case studies. We then went away and we designed the case studies, which we then asked the industry partners to validate to make sure that we capture their needs and requirements as they stated. We're now in the create phase where we're developing the capabilities to enable us to transform the data into the outputs that can be used by the sector. And the final stage of the project will be evaluate. And this is when we showcase the user stories and the data to our industry partners to understand if it actually can support their decision-making processes. So across the value chain of the Copernicus projects, what we're trying to do is demonstrate the credibility of the underpinning science, the relevance of those data sets that are being generated, both particularly for the energy sector as well as the stakeholder data, but also because we're part of a wider Copernicus European effort, we've got very legitimate data sets that are enabling us to transform data into value-added products. And through our engagement with industry and the wider community, we're looking to take the climate data, transform it into climate services, which enables it to be used by industry as products and services. And again, this is a feedback loop of people feeding back where the gaps and requirements are and really developing new capabilities based on that. So the more people engage, the better it is for the life cycle development of these services. So the user requirements, when we had interviews and workshops, these are some of the key questions that they asked us. And it was what Copernicus data is available, how can I access it, what information does the Copernicus data hold, and how can I integrate this knowledge into decision making, and what value can it bring to my business applications. And the two last questions are the ones that we're really hoping to demonstrate within the case study examples itself. And what Copernicus provides us is a toolbox of capabilities where we have access to a range of different data sets to enable us to address those questions, from seasonal data, energy data, climate data. But a key part of this requirement is also accessing the user data as well. And this is to support validation and trust in some of the outputs that we're looking to generate. So this is a really key component of what we're trying to do. The two case studies we're working on are case study one, climate impacts on power and gas demand. So this is focused on longer term projections for longer term planning horizons. And case study two, seasonal climate forecast to identify risks of extremes to support energy balancing. And what we're trying to address is really two key questions. For case study one, it's how can the latest energy or climate projections add practical value, really focused on longer term strategic planning purposes. And within the case study, there is a current methodology that is used using an old climate data set. And we want to demonstrate the value of Copernicus data using the latest science and technology. Does this add any value to their decision-making processes? For the second case study, how can seasonal forecasts add practical value? And at the moment, the industry primarily use climatology as their basis to understand what it will be. And what we're trying to demonstrate, does seasonal forecast information provide an additional layer of intelligence to optimize decision-making processes? And the benefits that we expect to deliver through the case studies are, for case study one, we want to raise the awareness of climate impacts. Looking at how the latest scientific and technical advances can be incorporated, and also promote decision making based on using the latest climate science to enable organisations to optimise their decision making processes. And this is primarily focused on longer term strategic planning. Seasonal climate forecasts are really focused on early warning of higher than normal seasons, and to provide seasonal forecasts of periods of severity ahead of the season. So really looking at an early warning service or risk, allowing organisations to mitigate that risk or really optimise their trading positions if they operate within those sectors. So just to summarise, the value of the case studies is to recognise the value of the Copernicus climate change service through developing two case studies that show the value to the users. And we also want to explore the practical value that the energy sector can deliver from this, and how it can enable decision-making processes to occur, and also to assess the value add of these new data sets targeted at the two specific case studies themselves. So I will now hand over to my colleague, Joana.
Morning, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. So I'm going to give an overview and a description of what we're currently doing with the case studies. So first of all, just wanted to highlight the different timescales that the energy sector operates in, and the value that can be extracted from across these timescales. So in terms of historical data, so past weather can provide information to help manage future risks. In terms of weather timescale, that is from now up to 1-2 weeks ahead, this usually is able to support operational decisions. And looking out to a few months, so seasonal timescale, that gives an indication of the likelihood of, for example, extreme events or severe events to happen, and also an indication of the variability against climatology. And finally, looking out to decadal and a few 100 years ahead on a climate scale, this can help prepare in the longer term and inform mitigation and adaptation strategies. So to highlight the value of information, and particularly for those activities that are highly dependent or on which the weather has a high impact. So if you don't have weather and climate information, and it becomes very difficult to quantify uncertainty. And this means that the risks associated with, say, extreme events of climate change are very difficult to assess. So decisions are suboptimal, which can lead to high costs. So the advantages of having climate information are not only to understand the impacts of a changing climate, but also assist in mitigating those impacts in specific applications. So we're able to quantify uncertainty and make better assessments of the risks, able to optimize decisions, and potentially lower the costs associating with preparing against and managing those risks. I'm going to give a couple of examples from previous demonstrators. As Alberto mentioned, the European Climate Energy Mixer, so the ECEM case study, where it really highlights the benefits of using climate information. And this is an example drawn from the case study to evaluate the impact of extreme winters on future power systems. And the figure on the top left is showing that the winter of 2009-2010 in the UK was actually consistent with an unusually cold winter when imposed on a 40-year upward trend, as you can see with the red ball highlighting it. So we know that energy demand is strongly related to temperature, or at least in much of the European countries. And in this particular winter, as the high demand that we saw across several European countries is due to cold temperatures. As the winter temperatures are projected to increase, we can also see in the plot below that there's a downward trend in the projected demand. So looking into the future, and this is not shown in these plots, but was one of the results, the main results from this case study, is that we expect fewer demand peaks due to cold temperatures during the winter in the UK. However, there's not a clear trend, for example, if the wind resource is going to decrease in the winter in the future. But we know that as installed capacity increases, then low wind winters will have a bigger impact on power systems. So you can find more information on this demonstrator and the case studies on the link below. Another example drawn from the UK climate projections from 2018. These are climate analysis and projection data sets that are generated from the Met Office Hadley Centre Climate Programme. And the highlight message from these climate projections were that we expect greater chance of warmer and winter winters and hotter and drier summers. So here an illustration of the projections for two emission scenarios for the temperatures in the UK, which both of them show an expected increase in temperature. However, the lower emissions show a fastest rate in the near future, whereas the RCP 8.5 expects that change to be fastest at the end of the century. So looking into the results for precipitation, so the winter plot on the left shows that we expect precipitation to increase significantly in the winter. However, in the summer, we expect that to decrease. However, when it rains, one of the results show that that the summers may actually be even more intense. Again, more information can be found in the link below. So just a brief recap, building on top of what Alberto mentioned in his presentation. So the C3S Climate Data Store and what's available. So we've got 3 streams: historical from 1979 to present, seasonal forecast starting in 2017, but also hindcast between 1993 and 2016, as well as climate projections starting 2006 up to 2100. And you can access all of this data in the CDS website. Simply link to the website, do a search, select the data set you want to retrieve, and it will appear a page similar to this one with an overview or a description of the full data set, and then you can click on the download data. So it's as simple as that. So for the more specifically for the C3S Energy Demonstrator, we want to take a few steps forward, and particularly to support the European energy sector. So one of the things that we've done was to collect the data, the gridded data from the CDS, and apply bias correction on the climate indicators, but also use additional data sets such as the ENSO and ENSO-E to produce the energy indicators. And these can be provided in country or regional averages. If you want to know more about how the specifics of how these data sets have been created, you can watch the previous webinars from the C3S Energy. So just to give an overview of the 3 streams that are available through the C3S Energy. In terms of historical data from the era 5, we've got energy indicators such as temperature, radiation, precip, wind speed, and mean sea level pressure. And these are provided on an hourly time series on both country and regional spatial aggregations. So for the energy indicators, we've got demand, solar power, wind power, and hydro, some of which are hourly and others on a daily time series. For the climate projections, we're drawing them from the Eurocodex climate projection models. Again, same energy indicators, climate indicators, for which we've applied bias correction, and some of them are 3 hourly time series and others daily. So for the similar thing for the energy indicators, with similar spatial and temporal aggregation as the climate indicators. So finally, for the seasonal forecast data, these are drawn from 3 main seasonal models from ECMWF, CS5, Meteor France System 6, and Met Office Glossy 5. So we've got temperature, radiation, wind speed, and precip, a country level, 6 hourly and daily. And in terms of energy indicators, the same sort of spatial and temporal resolution. So these are some of the results drawn from our C3S Energy colleagues. Not shown here. We've seen that different scenarios for the mid-century show a negative change in wind and solar power from most European countries, and actually a positive change in hydropower, except for some countries in Southern Europe. So one of the questions that we're often asked is, for example, is the wind resource going to decrease in the future? Are wind droughts going to become more frequent or not? Or when addressing these questions, we need to really understand the capability of climate and seasonal projections, for example, and what is the actual predictability across Europe. And we've seen that it actually can change or vary quite widely between different countries and regions. So the benefits that we're hoping to draw from the C3S Energy case studies is essentially that we want to illustrate that these data sets can be used by the energy sector to improve knowledge in seasonal and climate information, for example, in historical climate variability and future trends, but also to support long-term decision-making between months to years ahead, and help mitigate climate impacts on the energy sector. So for the first case study, our aim is to evaluate the impacts on the future gas demand. And for this, we're going to base on the current methodology that is developed by XoServe. So XoServe is the British entity responsible for gas balancing and ensures that the market runs efficiently and reliably, but it's also the main data provider across the entire network, delivering services to gas suppliers, shippers, and transporters. So what's the state? So we've seen recent changes in gas demand, and the industry wants to understand why. Until very recently, the observed long-term climatological averages were used as baseline, but we know that they no longer provide a representative baseline for predicting a typical weather and demand for the future. So the current methodology to estimate gas demand in the longer term is based on what is called the composite weather variable, or CWV, and this is estimated for a period representative of the next 10 years. So the future likely gas demand is predicted for the next 10 years, but it is reviewed every 5 years. So the next review is effective from 2020 up to 2030. So we'll be assessing the period between 2020 and 2025, and this is to compare with the previous review. So the final step is where end users use this information to feed into their own demand forecasting models. So this is where we have been closely engaging with the industry partner to identify the benefits of reviewing the methodology. And here are some of the questions that we've been asked by our stakeholders. So these are very striking questions. However, we will not be able to answer all of them because our scope in the case studies is much more limited. But it's important just to put this out there so that other people listening to this webinar might relate to some of these questions. So essentially, you want to understand What are the plausible causes for the changes in gas demand in recent years? Is it due, for example, to changes in consumer behavior or prices, or is it actually being driven by climate change? So what is the actual role of climate change in these changes in gas demand? We know that the CWV value is strongly dependent on the temperature, but the industry often wonders if using additional values such as precipitation, solar radiation, and wind would actually add any value to the calculation of this CWV. So what we want to understand with this case study is essentially to know whether the CWV value will change when we apply the new C3S datasets for a period representative of 2020-2025. So the methodology that we're going to apply will be based on adjusting historical observations and then producing the climate projections for the relevant meteorological variables. Then we want to calculate the increments between the value of these meteorological variables in the future compared to a baseline year, and then validate the projected data against sites across the UK. And finally, compare the new C3S capability with the previous XoServe study. So this is where we are at the moment. We've been busy with retrieving the data from the C3S Energy, so the climate projections and the Euro 5, as well as quality controlling the data from observation data from stations and gas demand. And we want to look at the climate indicators of temperature, radiation, wind speed, and precipitation. And here just a bit more detail on which climate models we're actually going to look at. So we're going to look at RCM projections for emission scenarios, RCP 4.5. So that's about 12 models. Just a note on the start date is slightly different. So some of them start in 1950 and 1951, others start in 1970. And we want to extract for the specific period of 2020 and 2025 because this is the requirement from our stakeholders, and compare it to the baseline year of 2011-2012, which was the same one that was used in the previous study. So for the Euro 5, we are extracting historical data from the beginning of the data sets, that is from 1979 up to now. And the observations that we have available are for 26 UK stations for the period between 1960 and 2012. And we're also using the gas demand for the validation between 2012 and 2017. So just a brief comparison with the data that was used on the previous study. So the climate projections drawn from QMP and CMIP 5, and the period for the climate projections was actually starting in 2012. Same observations, but you can notice that we didn't have demand data, so this is a novelty for this particular case study. Another variable that was used in the previous case study is relative humidity, which currently is not directly provided by C3S Energy, but we're looking into ways to derive it from the available parameters. So we're now looking into doing a sensitivity analysis, essentially because we want to compare the station data, which starts in 1960, and the gridded Era 5 data, which starts in 1979. And we want to understand the differences also between using a longer or shorter training periods and how this will impact the various stages of the methodology. So the next steps will be to draw the climate projections, produce hourly time series for the period 2020 out to 2025, but also looking into the percentiles and particularly the extremes of the distribution. And we're going to do this in a two-staged approach. So first is a demonstration of the methodology. So we start with running a training period, comparing the station data with Euro 5 and validation between 1996 and 2005. And then once we're happy with this, we apply the methodology to the complete historical record. We want to make sure that we still retain the natural interannual variability around the trend. So we're going to look at, again, the comparison between using the station data and the Euro 5 with different periods, and in the end, get the projections for the next 5 years and compare it against the previous case study. And finally, as we have demand data, it will be really valuable to validate these projections against these observations to really understand how good these projections are. So just to recap from case study 1, what we want to address is that the new C3S data can improve the predictability compared to the previous XoServe exercise, and essentially answer the question of, will the industry need to review the methodology or not? So moving on to case study 2 on seasonal impacts. Some of you might remember, this is quite fresh in our memories. In the last few years, we've experienced the consequences of an increasing number of extreme events. So we've had cold spells and strong easterly winds and heavy snow, known as the Beast from the East, and this was just last year, which swept across Europe. And this was only comparable more recently to the freezing weather of December 2010. On the other hand, also last year in the UK, we had one of the hottest summers ever recorded. And just to draw a contrast here with the summer of 2015, where the temperatures were on average very low and with quite high precipitation. So our aim for this case study is to assess how useful seasonal information can be for the energy sector. So we'll take these severe events that had significant impacts, and particularly on the energy sector, as they led to peaks in energy demand in gas and electricity. So this drove, in some areas, a lot of renewables generation, in other areas less renewables generation, but also particularly in the winter, there was a risk of gas storage levels being depleted. So essentially, there was a lot of volatility in gas and electricity prices. Again, some of the questions that we've been asked from our stakeholders that are useful to put them out there, but however, again, not the full scope of these case studies. So some of the questions when talking about the impacts of seasonal and extreme events were also climate related. So for example, how do the seasonal extremes relate with projected climate change? Will the frequency of such events likely to increase in the future? So how will this affect supply and demand, and can renewables offset the energy prices, for example? how will this affect the European interconnected market? So for instance, can more PV in the south and high wind in the north compensate for high demand? So these are some of the open questions. So for this case study, we will split it into two parts. So the first one will focus on analyzing the impacts for gas demand. So currently, an estimate of winter demand is made ahead of the winter using historical data, assuming a climatological risk of weather and associated demand. And in this case study, we want to understand whether seasonal forecasts can be used to assess demand ahead of season. In terms of renewable supply and demand, we want to look at some of the past extreme events that had most impact on the power systems, and again understand the usefulness of utilizing the seasonal forecast information ahead of these seasons. So where we are at the moment is, as the climate projection data is just being finished to be produced, so we are retrieving data from C3S seasonal forecasts. We also have want to compare with historical data, and we want to do this on a country or regional level. Again, the climate indicators that we're interested in are temperature, radiation, wind speed, and precipitation. And energy indicators are the same as before. So for the gas demand, the analysis will be focused on 14 UK regional groupings in the UK that are defined by the industry called the grid supply point regions. And for the renewable supply demand analysis, we're focused mostly on a country level, starting with the UK, and potentially we'll look into the neighbouring countries. So next steps will be to look into a more detail into one of those events that have happened more recently, so the winter and summer of last year, winter 2010 and summer 2015. And then we want to produce the seasonal forecasts, essentially to give us an indication of the changes against climatology for the season ahead. And we want to, because we want to understand how good or bad these forecasts were, we want to compare with the actual recent events. So essentially, the questions we want to answer are: how well could these extremes have been predicted? How far in advance? And which regions would be mostly affected? Similar approach for the renewable supply demand, whereby we want to produce the seasonal forecasts for wind, solar, and hydro. So we want to understand whether the next few months could be more or less windy, or cold or sunny compared to climatology, and compare it to actual events, so we really understand the value of these forecasts, and essentially answer the same questions. Could this have been predicted? How far in advance? And which countries or regions would be mostly affected? So just to sum up, what we want to address with these case studies, with this case study, is how well can an extreme or severe event be predicted, and how far in advance, and how can effectively seasonal forecast information help prepare for these events for the season ahead. And that's all. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline and Joanna, for this very elucidating presentations around the case studies. As you also noticed, the case studies are progressing in line with the development of the project. So there's still a few months to go before the end, and we've also wanted to take this opportunity also to share a bit the thought process with you in terms of how we are addressing this case studies. in case you'd like also to provide some feedback. So we've received a few questions already, but please continue to ask them. And I'm going to now show the screen with the presentation, so our speakers, Caroline and Joanna, can address them, and if there is need, I can also provide some answers. So the first question, let's see, it's coming up on the screen. Okay, so here you have all the questions so far, and I will add them as they come in, so please continue to ask them. First question, maybe for Joanna, is how do you average grid data into regional country data?
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yes. Okay. Good. So some of these aggregations are already provided from the C3S Energy from our colleagues in Meteo France and CEA. So the additional one that we'll have to do for the seasonal case study will use a similar approach of essentially overlaying the NUTS shape files on the grid data, and we'll average around those the borders on top of the grid data. So we can do this. You can select this on a country level that corresponds to the NUTS 0, or regional level it corresponds to NUTS 2. So essentially, is combining shape files with NetCDF files.
Okay, thank you, Joanna. Would you like to address the second one for XoServe work on CWB, so the composite weather variable? Have you got information for energy efficiency, which has a huge impact on domestic gas demand? And Duncan Sluice said that he may be able to help with this in future if you have not.
Thank you very much, because we don't have information on energy efficiency. So if you're able to help, we'll be very, very keen to take your offer.
Okay. Going to the next question. How do you define the difference between extreme and severe weather event?
So essentially, this has to do with how they compare with climatology and in which part of the distribution we can see them. So extreme, we can often see this in the tails of the distribution, and severe. It's essentially different thresholds compared to climatology.
Okay, and I'm going to read this. You don't see that at the minute, but what impact on energy has a flood like the one that is occurring at the moment in the north of UK? Is it an effect of the competition of the different suppliers? You can, I don't know if you...
I don't know how to answer. It's hard to tell without looking at the data and without engaging with the end users and people who are actually being affected. So not having access to that information, it's hard to give a concrete answer, I'm afraid.
Okay. I'm just going to have a couple of other questions coming in, and I'm going to capture them on the slide. While I do that, I just read it out. So case study 2. This is from Andre Stocknell. Can the seasons be shorter, say 1 month ahead? Can such data be extracted and analysis done by users now?
So the data will be available on the climate data store, and the data will be available for the months up to 7 months ahead. So you can extract it for the month ahead, for the season ahead, i.e. for the 3 months ahead, etc. But you can find more information about what is actually being produced from the seasonal forecasts and how from the previous webinar on the seasonal forecasts.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another question also from Andre Stocknell. It's I think on a similar line. I'm just going to display this. On C3S, would a facility to select a subset of the data by lat and latitude and longitude be available soon? Currently, we had to download the entire set and then narrow it down ourselves to say the UK.
So is that for me or for you, Albert?
Yeah, well,
so yeah, from at least from the C3S Energy, they will be available on a country level. So for the energy and climate indicators, some of them will be available on a regional level. So you should. I don't necessarily know how this will show up on the CDS, but I'm guessing you will be able at least to select one of these levels of aggregation.
yeah,
Alberto,
okay.
you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, just to add, basically, one thing is to say that we do have the variables that Joanna mentioned available and ready to be made public, but they are on the pipeline for publication on the climate data store, so they are not quite available yet. They're coming, and we expect within maybe 2 months. There is a bit of a queue on the CDS pipeline, so we're waiting to get on top of or just reach the head of the queue. If there is a specific request, we can try to address it in the meantime directly, but we prefer to go through the official channel of the CDS. In terms of selecting lat-long on the CDS, this is actually something that can be done already on any data on the CDS. You're not able to do it if you use the graphical interface, but in any case, I think I'm not sure it's possible. So the best way is always to do a request through a local script, normally a Python script. And when you use that, you can always select a specific domain. So that's something that can be done for year 5 or any data set. In our case, for energy, this will be possible only for wind and solar data because any electricity demand and hydropower will only be available as country averages. That's how they are calculated. So we don't go into finer details than that. But it is possible to do for wind and solar. So I hope this addresses all the questions we received, and also thanks to Duncan for the additional details that I will pass on to Caroline and Joanna. And with that, we'll like just to go to the wrap-up session. And I just want to mention that, as I said before, we are looking to develop a visual demonstrator for the C3S Energy. At the moment, there's no immediate solution, but one possible visual demonstrator could be the one that we see here on the slide now. So coming from the two visual demonstrators we had before, the ECEM and C4E, as we mentioned before, we will looking to converge and come into one visual demonstrator, which may look like the one on the right hand side here. Then I just want to remind you about the series of webinars that we've been running under C3S Energy. So this was the 5th one at the bottom, but we do have 1, 2, 3, 4 already available online with both presentations and recording. So I encourage you to go back and look at them. In fact, you can also view the previous webinars from the ECEM contract, where we had 5 or 6 or more webinars there too, and you can see also the evolution of some of the developments that have been done. It might be interesting for you to follow that, and some of the information is still relevant there. I'm going to give now the links, so if you want to access those webinars, you can click on the link at the top, or select and type the link. And in terms of C3S Energy web page, directed to the Climate Copernicus EU website. I'd like to thank again the two presenters, Caroline and Joanna, for the great presentations. I'd like to thank also the all the attendees. We had many people attending, and also for asking questions. Please come back to us if you would like to know more, direct by email or looking at the website, and also watch this space for the next webinar. We don't have a date yet, but we aim to have one around January, February, to keep in line with the 2 monthly webinars we've been having. So have a good day, evening, or night, afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much for your attendance again, and goodbye.
Okay.